Today I'm going to be covering closing costs here in New Mexico. So whether you're buying a house or you're selling a house, what are the costs associated with doing either of those things, and just a general explanation and overview of all of it. So hope you enjoy a little bit of information around closing costs. So what we're going to cover today is kind of a combination of things. One of the pieces being the no state transfer tax. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth. We're going to talk about what the buyers typically pay in a transaction. We're going to talk about what the sellers typically pay in a transaction. And then whether you're on either side, we're going to talk a little bit about how to keep more of that money at the table for a better advantage selling or buying a house. So first, I did think I need to explain a little bit about what a closing cost is. So some people have a perception that closing costs are just everything inside of the fees that you have to buy a home or sell a home, but they are a specific division of the overall fees, right? Your closing costs are particularly the fees that a lender is going to charge you to originate the loan, the fees that a title company is going to charge you to insure the title policy, and then possibly your realtor has fees that they are going to charge you. And so those three things combined are really what closing costs are comprised of, and or any other fees that you may pay during the process. Let's say you as a buyer agreed to pay for landscaping or something before closing. That could be incorporated into closing costs. A down payment is not part of your closing costs, although it gets confusing because we say when you bring all of the money to closing, this is what you're going to bring to closing and this is your cost. Technically, your down payment is separate of your closing costs. So when you look at the cost to buy a home, I usually tell buyers to estimate between 2 and 5% to buy that home. And when I say 5% or 2 to 5%, it's of the sales price. So if you're looking at, $400,000 property, 1% of that would be $4,000 and 2% would be $8,000. That's your closing cost variable. And then you have your down payment for whatever money you're bringing percentage-wise as a down payment. So just keep that in mind. Closing costs are not the same as all of the fees that you're bringing to closing, but they are a pretty distinct set of different things. They're also negotiable. So I think that's a big thing that many people, are unaware of. These fees are negotiated during the point of contract. So when we go under contract to buy a piece of property with a buyer client, we get to put in the contract which fees the buyer is paying and which fees the seller is paying. So it's not always that you have to pay all your closing costs. It's going to be market dependent a little bit. And so that's where you have this variable you have to keep in mind that it depends on the deal that you're working, how much your closing costs may or may not be. So, theme of this whole hour, or I guess however long this takes me to go through this material, it's not to scare you and to say that there's going to be these super high costs. Costs are not scary, but they are when we have no plan for them. So when we try to plan to buy a home, or when we do plan to buy a home, absolutely you want to consider these costs, but they're not a scary thing. We just have to be ready to pay them. So the first kind of piece of this, many states outside of New Mexico have what's called a sales tax or a sales transfer tax. And when you sell a property, the state actually charges you a percentage or a fee to do that. In New Mexico, they do not have a state sales transfer tax, which is amazing. Meaning that when you sell a home as a seller, you're actually saving a little bit more money than if you were to sell that same home in a different state that does charge that. Some of those fees in certain states go up to 1% of the purchase price. So again, on like a $400,000 home, you'd be paying that $4,000 to the state just to make the transfer. So we don't charge any. The line item on that is simply zero. Mainly that affects the sellers. It doesn't really affect the buyer in that regard because in those other states, the seller is the one paying that tax. But in New Mexico, we don't have that. It's a really good thing for our people here in New Mexico, and I think it's a positive overall. So does no transfer tax actually change how you sell the property? The savings are real. From a tax perspective, you're not paying the government that extra, X amount of dollars. But the reality is that you do have a general neutrality in the market because ultimately nobody pays that. So yes, you do, it does change how you sell from not having to make that physical payment from the tax perspective, but nobody makes that payment. And so there is that layered there. The question is, what do you do with those savings, right? Do you pull that equity or that savings into the next home and put it into equity? Do you, put it back in your pocket? It's just kind of dependent on how you feel. So jumping into some common questions I get. Does New Mexico have any transfer or deed tax? Just cover that. No, we do not have a transfer or a deed tax that they charge upon the transfer of the property. And then is it selling here really cheaper? We're going to go over what those costs kind of look like roughly. I wouldn't argue it's cheaper from the overall economy standpoint, but when you look at per deal, absolutely, if there's not that extra tax that you're paying to the government, it is a little bit cheaper. So something to keep in mind. So we're getting back into what the seller typically pays. So the reason why the seller closing costs and the buyer closing costs are different is because it's negotiable. Now, the negotiability of those costs does not mean that there aren't, somewhat habitual type of deals that occur. And what I mean by that is most of the time, in some instances, sellers pay standard fees in New Mexico and buyers pay some other standard fees. And that's just kind of what's agreed upon because of industry practice. But it by no means is not negotiable. All of these variables are negotiable. So this slide here, I want to be very clear. If this does not match your current situation for selling your home, it may not, because that deal is negotiable with your individual buyer and your individual people involved in that deal. So the way that this works out typically in New Mexico, what we see usually in the deals in New Mexico is that the owner's title insurance policy is paid by the seller. So a new buyer comes in to purchase this property, and in some cases, or most cases, the seller is paying the title company to ensure that the title is clear of any, problems that the new buyer is going to walk into. So that's what you typically see on deals, but you could negotiate that to the other side if the buyer was willing to pay that, right? Real estate commissions, which absolutely are negotiable 1,000%. What we're seeing in most offers right now is that the buyers are asking the seller to pay for the commissions of the buyer's broker. That's not every deal. I've had transactions where, they come back and they say, hey, we're willing to pay this amount, but not that amount. And it's all negotiated when we actually go forth with the contractual process. And so real estate commissions in general are negotiable, but what I see most of the time is that sellers are agreeing to pay out either all or a percentage of the commissions for the buyer's side. That's just what you see kind of standard here in New Mexico. Gross receipts tax on commission. So this is one thing that people don't actually, a lot of people aren't aware of when they go to sell their home in New Mexico. Gross receipts tax is a tax charged on the money made from the transaction. And so, for instance, when a commission is charged, the state charges a gross receipts tax on that commission amount. And typically, that can range from 7% to 8%, depending on which part of, Albuquerque or Rio Rancho you're in or wherever else. But that's kind of what you're looking at. And here I put 7 to 8.5%, depends on the area. But they charge that based on the amount of money generated from services rendered on the real estate transaction. So yeah, that last note there, it applies to commission, not the whole sales price. So the gross receipts tax is not this big giant tax. It's not a transfer tax. It's just charged on the commissions that are being represented. But when you talk with a seller and you hope that they are going to understand the net out and all of the other numbers that come with selling their home, that is a piece that you have to bring up, because selling a home in New Mexico does have gross receipts tax incorporated into it. One biggest caveat here for me to just be very clear is the fact that these are all negotiable. I know I've said that like 5 times already, but I have to make that a point here because I don't want anybody to misrepresent what I'm saying when I say these are the seller fees. These are the seller fees if the seller agrees to them to sell their home. If they decide they don't want to pay commissions out, they don't have to do that. It's just dependent on what they decide they want to do in order to sell their property. So that's what you see typically on the seller side is some of those fees kind of stacking up. The title policies and in general, the gross receipts and commissions are some of their largest that you see. The other thing that this could incorporate with sellers as well is concessions back from the seller to the buyer. And I'm going to talk about that in the buyer section, but this could raise the seller's closing costs depending on what's agreed upon during the inspection period. So something to consider also. Is gross receipts tax the most misunderstood cost? I think probably yes, mostly because people are often not told about it until they get to the closing table. You see this happen a lot, and my clients in particular, I I don't necessarily have a huge deal with this, but in some cases you do see that gross receipts tax becomes a pivot point on the closing table because it is a line item on the settlement statement when both parties close the deal. And so it is something you want to consider to address with your people before you get to the closing table, because it can become an issue when they see a charge that they're not aware of. But once it's explained and it's educated on that it is a state tax, there's we have to charge that, or they have to charge that. It typically is not as big of a deal. It's not as big of a fee as most people assume, and so that's something that you want to consider also. Why is there a tax on the commission? To be blunt, ask the state of New Mexico. I don't know. I would prefer there not to be a tax on the commission, but I can't really answer that. Who pays for title insurance? So depending on the negotiation, it's depends. But most of the time when you're looking at a title policy, the seller is purchasing that before they sell the home. And so they purchase that on behalf of the buyer, and the buyer now holds that title policy until they go to sell the house, and then probably they'll pay for it. The reason I say that's negotiable is because it's dependent on the market. If we're in a market where there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homes for sale, and the buyer is at the advantage in terms of the availability of homes, there's no way that they're going to pay for the title policy. Does that make sense from a transactional perspective? Why would the buyer do that when they have so many other options? Unless they absolutely loved that one home and that was the one for them. In the inverse, if the sellers are in the advantage in the market, meaning there's not very much inventory, they have a lot of power over how they sell their house, doing inspections, etc. That may be something that they say, hey, I want the buyer to pay for the insurance policy. I want to save that little bit of extra cash, and so I'm negotiating that in. But in most cases, title insurance is paid for by the seller when they go to sell the property. And then, is the commission itself fixed? Again, it's negotiable. It is not fixed to any degree, to any amount. So just something to keep in mind, that yes, you can negotiate your commission with your real estate broker, whether you're selling a house or whether you're buying a house. And I would recommend doing it. At least ask, why not? So now jumping into a little bit of what the buyer typically pays. So this is a really interesting perspective because this can go up and down based on how willing the buyer is to purchase that property, right? I typically recommend, as you can see in the red, I typically tell buyers that you need to have 2 to 5% set aside for closing costs. And that's separate of your down payment. So if your down payment's 20% of the purchase price, you need to have an additional 2 to 5% set aside for closing costs. The closing costs the buyer typically sees are lender fees, which includes the lender origination fee and the underwriting fee, but they vary, right? So that's also why shopping possibly sometimes a lender is not a terrible idea, because their fees are different from company to company. Every company charges differently based on what their back end looks like and operation looks like, etc. Typically in this market, at least, the buyers are also paying for the appraisals, and they're also paying for inspections typically. Again, that's negotiable. If we wanted to negotiate in that the seller was going to pay for the buyer's appraisal, we could, but that's not usual what you see in the market. And depending on the property and the price point, it's going to be rare that we get that in a deal that's not already, a buyer's market in that sense. There also are some fees that you may have during the process. That's something to consider that I always talk to buyers about. I always talk about closing costs, and I always talk about upfront costs, the way I kind of divide them. Closing costs are things you pay at the closing table, meaning you don't pay that money until you get there. Upfront costs can be like inspections, appraisals, all those fees are incorporated, but you're going to have those expenditures during the actual under contract process. So you need to have that money as well to pay for some of those things that just don't get done right at closing also. Prepaid. So your property taxes, your homeowner's insurance, those get dropped into escrow when you start paying your mortgage. And so those are something you want to consider when you're making your first payments. You're going to have some of those prepaids go into the escrow accounts. And then your rising insurance costs are something that I think you need to consider it as you're buying a home. Insurance is going to keep going up overall. Hey, thank you, Frankie. I appreciate you, man. I just saw your comment. FYI, white post at the bottom makes so viewers can't read any comments. Hey, I was trying to fix that issue. I was thinking about pulling it up here. Does this look better? Because it cuts me off, but I could raise the camera next time so I could kind of see it. What is your opinion, Frankie? This is actually super nice to have you in the chat. Okay, cool. So I'm going to do this for now, but next time I'll raise the camera and lower it so that you can see my full head. But this way you can see the chat. That makes perfect sense. Thank you, Frankie. I appreciate you, bro. So jumping right back into the buyer typical costs. Insurance, I was saying, make a custom background on Canva. It helps a ton. Oh, great idea, dude. I will do that. That's a great idea. And then I could just plaster part of it to have open for this stuff too. Okay, perfect. Anyway, so the insurance stuff, I wrote an article on my website about this yesterday or the day before. So if you want some more information about insurance and where they're going and stuff, it's important to keep in mind as you're buying a house that the insurance companies are getting stricter and stricter and stricter on what they require for insurance. They also are getting more costly in terms of what they actually cost. So what happens with your mortgage payment as a buyer is you make a payment to your mortgage company, and they will effectively drop that money into a escrow account, and then they make payments to your insurance company and to the taxes that they need to pay through the mortgage. And so sometimes when your insurance policy goes up, your mortgage could actually rise that next year because the insurance went up and now your mortgage was based on that insurance cost from last year. So something to keep in mind with buyers and prepaids is that as we get further into this insurance rise, your costs when you come to closing might be a little higher than you're expecting because of some of that insurance stuff. So, are rising insurance costs quietly inflating your closing? I just talked about that. They absolutely could. So what exactly is a prepaid? This is some commonly questions I get asked. A prepaid is just the money you're putting forward in your mortgage payment to sit in an account until those other bills are due. So when you have your mortgage payment, you have your monthly interest and premium that you're paying to the mortgage company. You have the interest or the taxes that you're paying to the government, and then you have the insurance that you're paying. And so what happens when you make that, let's just hypothetically say $1,500 payment, $500 is going towards your mortgage, $500 is going toward taxes, $500 is going towards the insurance. The insurance and the taxes are only due every so often, and so when that bill comes due, the money is sitting in the account in order to pay it. But that's what a prepaid is. You're prepaying it on your mortgage, and it sits in an escrow account with your mortgage company, and then they pay out your insurance and your taxes when that time comes. Can I shop for lower lender fees? Absolutely, you can shop for lower lender fees. The biggest thing I'll tell you with lenders and in regards to how they operate, choose somebody that's going to be a great lender and a great fit for what you need out of the transaction. Yes, you can get a better deal pretty much anywhere you go if you really, really shop. It's like buying a car, right? I could go do it. But is the time and the effort and the energy worth it for you to go find a little bit of a fractional better deal? And what does that lender look like when they're actually in a transaction? Some lenders can bomb a transaction and make it really difficult if they're a bank lender or someone who just doesn't have as much care. That may be worth you paying a little bit extra on the lender side, but that's a you decision. I can't make that distinction. And then why are my costs higher than a friend who bought 2 years ago? This is a real scenario. It can absolutely happen. Mainly, one would be appreciation of sales prices, but two probably are going to be that insurance contingency that I just talked about. The insurance costs have been rising. It's getting more expensive to insure. And so your cost from 2 years ago could be drastically different if the insurance policy is drastically different. So keep that in mind. So how to keep more at the table? This is something that I think everybody's wanting to know. How can I negotiate some of these costs? One of them, I would say from a buying perspective, is asking for concessions. I'm seeing on average about a 2%, and that's going to be price point specific, but about a 2% ask on concessions right now from buyers. And that's average. So there's a lot that are coming in that are much higher, right? But let's say you had a $400,000 house, 2% would be $8,000. In terms of what the buyers are asking back from the sellers in order to transact that deal. So that's one way I think you can lower your closing costs as a buyer is you can go in and you can start to ask some sellers for some of these credits, and a credit would effectively be applied to your closing costs once you get to the table. And then shopping the lender and the title company, fees are not carved in stone, so that is absolute. You can absolutely shop around for cheaper fees per lender or per title company. In my experience, the title companies have very similar fee structures, so I don't know that you'll get a hugely better deal there, but there are drastic differences between some lenders, so definitely consider shopping that. Time your prepaids. Closing later in the month cuts the prepaid interest, so that's something that you could consider doing as well, as depending on your closing date. not the biggest difference it's going to make, but it's something. And then use assistance programs. I've written an article or a couple articles now about the MFA program, which is the down payment and closing cost assistance that New Mexico offers to first-time home buyers. Those programs are amazing if you qualify. There are income limits and there are certain things you have to, hoops you have to jump through to get the money that they are giving. But the reality becomes if you can't afford a home, this is a great way to kind of start that process, at least get some of the money you need to. And I want to clear that up. I don't want you to buy a house if you can't afford a house. Don't go house poor. But the reality is that there may be an instance where you just need that little extra help to get over that hump, and some of the assistance programs are really awesome in terms of what they offer. So all in all, that's kind of it. I think that that's where I'm going to end the stream today. There's not much more that I want to go over. Here's I think a good question mark here. Can I get the seller to pay my closing costs? So that's what I was talking about when I said seller credits. The way a credit works versus like a price reduction or a credit. The credit is just an agreed upon amount that the seller is given back to the buyer. So let's say we negotiate where your credit's $5,000. We can give the $5,000 back to the buyer at the closing table, and that would effectively mean that they don't have to bring that extra $5,000 to the closing table. So it would save them that money. Now the limit here is that there are limitations as to how much credit somebody can accept. So in some instances, you can only take this amount of credit, $4,000, but the seller's offering $5,000. Well, you could take the $1,000 and reduce the purchase price, right? Or whatever you want to do with it. But yes, I think there is opportunity to have the seller pay closing costs. Is there opportunity to have the seller pay all your closing costs? Probably not. We'd have to be in a crazy off-balance market for that to occur. Does closing timing really matter? I think yes. It also matters on your payment too. If you are closing in the end of this month, let's say, in August, you wouldn't have your first payment until October. But if you close September 1st, you wouldn't have your first payment until November. So that's where you do want to consider some of those. And then can assistance over closing costs, not just the down payment? Can assistance cover closing costs, not just the down payment? Yes, there are down payment assistance programs and there are closing cost assistance programs. So you have to qualify for both. And to be totally honest, there may be instances where you don't want to take all of it because there are stipulations on when you pay them back and things like that. And it may make more sense for you to just bring a little bit of your own cash and use one of the programs instead of both. So main takeaways, there's no state transfer tax. That saves the sellers here a little bit of money. The gross receipts tax is something that you'll see on the seller's side typically, but it could also be a buyer fee. And then buyers, I would estimate 2 to 5% to budget for closing costs. And sellers, you're probably looking at 1 to 2% for closing costs if you don't incorporate commissions. But other than that, I appreciate your time. If you guys have any questions, that's my phone number here at the top, I guess, now that I moved it. But have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.